When the ceasefire agreement in the Near East was announced, I was cautious. And there were people online actually suggesting that if you weren't gushing praise on Donald Trump, then you were somehow. One of the narratives I heard was you'd rather see people die than give Trump any credit. Well, what have we seen since then? The violence has not ended. There's been accusations of ceasefire violations by both sides, by Hamas and Israel, and that I think that's why it was far too premature to celebrate this. I mean, the history of the Middle East shows that. Of course, if it's an end of the major hostilities, that's a good thing, but you just have to look at Gaza to see this is going to take decades to rebuild. I mean, it really looks like a nuclear fallout zone. It reminds actually of Aleppo and Damascus. Aleppo and Homs perhaps is a better comparison during the Syrian war, which by the way isn't over. It's one of those conflicts that has kind of went into the back of headlines, but it's not entirely over. There's factional fighting within Syria that's killed thousands this year. And within Gaza itself, there's been factional fighting, which isn't really surprising. But I want to focus on a particular area of this conflict, which is the media bias. And I'm going to stick to the UK media here because it's obvious to me that there is a segment of the British press, and there's politicians as well, but for now I'm going to focus on the press, that are just so biased towards Israel, that they effectively, I would argue, dehumanize Palestinians by literally treating them as less worthy of coverage, i.e. a Palestinian civilian death just isn't worth the same coverage as an Israeli civilian death. Now, some of us happen to think that civilians being killed deliberately in a war zone is appalling, whichever side they're on. I'm consistent on this. I condemned the Hamas attack on Israel because it was overwhelmingly civilians on that occasion, more than 2/3 who were killed in sometimes horrific circumstances. But awful as that was, and as much as that must be condemned, and it exposes the brutality of Hamas, that doesn't mean that families being wiped out by Israeli airstrikes should be deemed to be less worthy. And I'm going to just focus on two newspaper reports, one from the left and one from the right. Now, the left is the Eye, and I think their coverage is more thorough. Why? Because they are actually giving the proportionate coverage of Palestinian deaths that it deserves, whereas the Daily Mail, which is the right-wing source, barely mentions the civilian dead. And the Daily Mail is not alone. The Daily Telegraph, their coverage of this conflict is just so biased to Israel, they barely even try to hide it. Every angle is about how Israel's been affected or how Israel's suffering. They just don't seem to care about Palestinian civilian suffering, which, yes, is partly the fault of Hamas, but it's also the fault of Israel's military campaign. So, this is in today's Daily Mail, page 12. 2 Israeli soldiers dead as truce falters. And this is today's Eye. Ceasefire in peril as Israel bombs Gaza, blocks aid and accuses Hamas of attack. Now, who actually broke the ceasefire, frankly, isn't the issue here. I don't trust either side. I don't trust Hamas, but I don't trust Israel either, quite frankly. Both have been proven to have put out lies before. So, whoever broke the ceasefire, it's beside the point. The issue here is about coverage, and what I really question is the fact that the Daily Mail chooses to cover the fact 2 Israeli soldiers dead as truce falters. Soldiers, combatants. I'm not saying it's justified, but they are combatants, they're soldiers. The Eye reports, and this is an abridged version because I don't want to make this video too long, but Gaza residents and local health authorities said that the airstrikes, this is the retaliatory airstrikes, well, retaliatory according to Israel, and tank fire killed 44 people, more than half of them at the Al-Ada hospital in the north of the enclave. A hospital. Of course, there's going to be some Hamas fighters among them. But time and time again, we see this situation whereby Israel gets away with just saying, well, we were targeting Hamas, so that's fine then. The mass slaughter of civilians is fine. Both papers cover the controversy around Aston Villa Football Club, which apparently has banned Tel Aviv fans, that is, Maccabi Tel Aviv fans from attending. Now, Maccabi Tel Aviv was in the news earlier, I think it was last year actually, at a match in Amsterdam, and that was described as an anti-Semitic pogrom because there was violence against the Tel Aviv fans. But Maccabi Tel Aviv has a reputation as well for hooliganism. So once again, are we really hearing the whole story? You know, a lot of the right-wing press were framing that as how awful anti-Semitism in Europe, you know, Israeli fans attacked. Well, and then once again, it's with the Eurovision as well, calls to ban Israel from the Eurovision. Here's the thing, if Russia can be stigmatized because of its killing of civilians in Ukraine and its brutality against civilians in Ukraine, should Israel really get a free pass? Now, the two conflicts are not exactly the same. It was Hamas that initiated this latest war with their brazen and brutal attack on Israel. That shouldn't be forgotten. That was the trigger point of this latest war. Whereas Russia invaded Ukraine as an escalation of its war against Ukraine since 2014. So the two conflicts aren't exactly the same. Nevertheless, in both cases, you have one party overwhelmingly targeting civilians. Russia targeting Ukrainian civilians, Israel targeting Gazan civilians. I just don't accept the argument we try to avoid civilian deaths. They know how densely built up it is. They're making their choice to go in there and carpet bomb the place. I just don't see how you can say, oh well, we give them warnings so that exonerates us. It's grotesque. Israel knows full well those people have nowhere to go. Ed Miliband said that Aston Villa Football Club can't become a no-go area for Jewish fans. I do think we should be careful about sectarianism in the UK, and I think the pro-Palestinian people should be careful about that, you know, because for one thing, not every Israeli supports Netanyahu. So I don't know. I'm not sure about that one, because it's like punishing all Russians for Putin's actions. There are Russians who have condemned the invasion of Ukraine, yet they're being tarred with the same brush. So, you know, if you're a Ukrainian or a Palestinian, you may well take the view, well, they're all collectively responsible. I just think we need to be a little bit wary of that. So as it stands, I wouldn't I don't know. I've mixed views about it. If Russia could be banned from events, should Israel? One thing that is for sure is that sectarianism in football is a very ugly thing. So any fans that are holding up anti-Jewish statements as opposed to, well, frankly, I don't think politics should be in football at all. I was going to say as opposed to anti-Israel statements, but is a football match the place to do that? I don't think so. Any fans, you know, celebrating Hamas, I really think they should be investigated by counter-terror police, quite frankly. But getting back to the issue at hand, the way the two papers have covered this, the eye is focusing on the fact that once again Gaza is being bombed. The Mail chooses to focus on the fact that 2 Israeli soldiers have been killed too, compared to 44 people. We always hear Hamas-run sources, the implication being, well, you can't trust it. But even if Hamas exaggerates some casualty figures, that doesn't change the fact that independent groups on the ground, aid agencies and so on, corroborate this. So this narrative of, well, Hamas runs things, so it must all be fake, emboldens far-right Israeli politicians to say there's no humanitarian crisis. Unless you're a barefaced liar or so biased towards Israel that you're just willing to turn a blind eye, everyone can see that there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. How anyone could deny that, I don't know. Even a right-wing tabloid, the Daily Express, and I give them credit for it, they had their front cover a starving Palestinian child. Now, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, I would single out those two papers particularly, probably the Sun, but they do come to mind. The Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail are so biased towards Israel that they just don't care about dead Palestinians. They just don't care. I mean, they will mention it in passing as part of a report, but they just don't focus on it, and that's plain to see. So I trust the Eye more than the Daily Mail on this because the Eye is more comprehensive. The Eye is, you might argue, the Eye is biased to the Palestinians. Not necessarily so. For instance, the Eye was very scathing about anti-Semitism in this country. Indeed, the Eye has a Jewish editor, Simon Kellner. So I don't, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily biased to the Palestinians. It's just that in a conflict where the overwhelming number of civilian deaths are on the Palestinian side, you can't be neutral. You can't say, well, both sides have equally suffered. It isn't an equilibrium. Both sides have suffered, but not to a proportionate measure. Israelis have had their lives threatened. They've had to live with air raid drills, but they haven't seen their cities turn to dust. They haven't seen entire families wiped out outside of October the 7th on the sort of scale that the Palestinians have. October the 7th was an appalling atrocity, but it was distinctive on its scale. The vast majority of attacks against Israel on a much smaller scale. That doesn't mean that Hamas doesn't want to harm Israeli civilians. They do. That's why I think it's valid to call them a terrorist organisation. I have no time for Hamas. I think they're a bunch of thugs. And I think they carry a lot of responsibility for the suffering of the Palestinian people because they brainwash children into hating Jews and hating Israelis. They spend all the money they get on weapons and building tunnels. So Hamas definitely bears a large deal of responsibility. But I also maintain the far-right Israeli politicians encouraging settler violence, advocating the absolute eradication of Gaza and the takeover of Gaza, they're absolutely responsible for the situation there as well. I remember the day that the hostages were released, Netanyahu didn't look happy. And I wondered, did he not look happy because he didn't really get what he wanted? What they want is a total takeover of Gaza. The violence has broken out again, so it's tragic to see, but the bias of the Daily Mail in favour of Israel and the Daily Telegraph, it fails journalism, it really does. And I think it needs to be called out. I do think it is dehumanising because if you are reporting Israeli civilians or any Israelis, even combatant soldiers, as being more worthy by definition than Palestinian civilians, then that really indicates a failure of journalism. But I do argue it's dehumanising. If you're deeming a Palestinian life to be worth less, they're not gonna. I'm not saying that they're coming out and vilifying them as human beings. I'm saying they just don't regard them as human beings. That's the problem. And it is, if you've got a conscience, you can't be okay with this. I don't see how anyone could be okay with that. There is a strong pro-Israel bias in this country. I've mentioned from right-wing media outlets. Probably GB News is the same. I don't give GB News much time, but I wouldn't at all be surprised if they've got similar coverage. 2 soldiers have been killed, so it must be the Palestinian side that violated it. I'll just add a little bit more because the Eye reports that, let's see here, Hamas's media office in Gaza said on Saturday that Israel had committed 47 violations since the ceasefire deal, leaving 38 people dead and 143 wounded. Well, I'm sure Hamas hasn't been innocent in that regard either, but it wouldn't at all surprise me. Let's not forget who Israel is run by right now. Not a moderate prime minister, not a moderate government. This is a far-right government that absolutely wants to just eliminate Gaza from the face of the earth because they see every Palestinian as a Hamas fighter. And with that mindset, then it's fair play to just kill them all. I think that's the attitude that Israel takes. And it's repugnant, frankly. I'm just going to read the little bylines here on the Eye. Main headline: ceasefire in peril as Israel bombs Gaza, blocks aid and accuses Hamas of attack. Fragile sense of calm in region is shattered by wave of airstrikes as the Israeli military and Hamas blame each other for breaching ceasefire. IDF claims it bombed terror targets, well that's what they always say, in response to alleged attack on Israeli soldiers in Rafah, and announces suspension of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Again, collective punishment. Hamas denies knowledge of anti-tank missiles. How do we know that's not another militant group in Gaza? It may actually not be Hamas. I don't trust them, but they're not the only militant group operating in Gaza. US Vice President J.D. Vance set to arrive in the region in an attempt to salvage peace plan, as Israel says it remains committed to 10-day-old ceasefire. Again, my cynicism about this is the extreme American bias towards Israel. Spoken about right-wing media bias. There's extreme American bias. The Americans are absolutely pro-Israel, so how can they really be peace brokers when they're so determined to take one side over the other? That just seems to me to be fundamentally a flawed premise. Okay, I'll wrap it up there, but this is sad to see, but unfortunately not surprising. Finally, on the point about anti-Semitism, it must be condemned. Anti-Jewish statements, attacks against synagogues and so on, it must be absolutely condemned. But I will say this, if you are a British Jew and you're supporting Israel, you cannot complain about being criticised for that. Not about being Jewish, but about defending Israel. If you're going to defend Israel, then it's fair play, as far as I'm concerned, for people to push back on that, provided it is focused on the politics, focused on the conflict, as opposed to you having Jewish identity. One of the things, I've said this before, one of the characteristics of anti-Semitism, like every form of hate and bigotry, is generalising the group as one and the same. But as far as I'm concerned, treating all Palestinians as if they're Hamas terrorists is just as bigoted as treating all Jewish people like they are pawns of Israel, when many Jewish people have criticised Israel. But to those pro-Israel Jewish people, we have free speech in this country. If you're going to vocally defend Israel, don't complain that people will criticise you. That's a controversial stance to take, given how many civilians have died. But if someone's attacking you simply for being Jewish, that's anti-Semitism and it should be condemned. The reason I mention that is because I have seen since Manchester some self-ascribed Jewish spokespeople say that it's not fair to link us to Israel, and yet they're actually defending Israel. Well, I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. You can't defend Israel on one hand and then say, don't link us to Israel. Which is it? If you're going to defend Israel as a British Jew, that's your right, but don't complain about it. I'm sorry, I feel that strongly. And to anti-Semites, stop generalising Jewish people. Stop vilifying all Jewish people because of what Netanyahu does. Don't forget there's young Israelis who have bravely torn up their conscription passes, risking imprisonment for doing so, because they feel it's morally wrong what their government's doing in Gaza. So that's why, getting back to the thing with Aston Villa, collectively punishing Israeli fans, I don't know if that's a good idea, and against generalisations across the board. So let me know your thoughts.